From ancient empires to Cold War tensions, how 5,000 years of power struggles built the modern world. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. The same geographical prize that empires fought over 5,000 years ago is still the battleground today. The exact territories that mattered to Sargon, to Cyrus, to the Ottomans, they matter for the precise same strategic reasons now. And by the end of this video, you'll see how a single principle of geography has orchestrated every major conflict from ancient Mesopotamia straight through to the moment the Berlin Wall fell. Stay with me, because that connection is the real story of power, and it will completely change how you read the news. If you've lived through any part of the 20th century, you've probably asked yourself why superpowers seem so obsessed with specific regions that looked, on the map, almost random. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, the Middle East. But they weren't random at all. I'd love to hear in the comments, what moment in history made you first wonder why these places mattered so much? And if you're new here, subscribe now, because every episode on this channel walks you through exactly how yesterday's empires became today's conflicts. The pattern will shock you. Wait, this part is critical, and I need your full attention for just a moment. Everything that follows hinges on understanding a single geographic truth that has never changed in 5,000 years. If you want to know exactly how geography determined every empire and every war, exactly which territories always mattered and why, and how that same geographic logic carried straight into the Cold War itself, our complete guide on this topic is available in the description and pinned in the comments. It's where the deep mechanisms are explained, the patterns, the hidden corridors of power, the moves on the board that empires made again and again. It's a guide that goes much further than we can here. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to a place where 5,000 years of warfare began with something far simpler: water. The Sumerians didn't choose Mesopotamia because they wanted to be cool, or because a real estate agent told them the investment potential was solid. They chose it because two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, made it possible to grow food in a place that would otherwise be desert. That single fact created the first civilization. But it also created the first problem. If you control the water, you control survival. If you control survival, you control people. And if you control people, you control everything. This is where the real story begins, not with kings and their ambitions, but with geography that forced kings to do what they did. Sargon of Akkad didn't conquer the cities of Sumer because he had a personality disorder. He conquered them because whoever controlled the headwaters controlled the breadbasket. His empire lasted a few centuries because the geography was on his side. The same logic applied when the Persians built their empire 3,000 years later. They didn't randomly choose which territories to conquer. They chose every single one, because each piece fit into a geographic puzzle. They controlled the passes through the mountains. They controlled the trade routes. They controlled the water sources. They controlled the choke points. And here's the thing that should make you sit up and pay attention. Every single empire that ever mattered, from Akkad to Rome to the Ottomans to the British, they all conquered the same territories in roughly the same sequence. Not because they were copying each other, but because the geography demanded it. Whoever held Mesopotamia had a food surplus. Whoever held Egypt had access to the Nile. Whoever held the Levant controlled trade between Africa and Asia. Whoever held the coastlines could project power across the seas. The geography wrote the script, and the empires just acted it out. Fast forward to 1945. The Second World War has just ended. Stalin, Truman, and Churchill are sitting down to divide the world. But they're not really dividing it. They're just following the same geographic logic that empires followed for 5 millennia. They draw lines on maps. They establish spheres of influence. They identify choke points. Berlin, Korea, the Strait of Hormuz. But the choke points aren't new. The same geographic zones that mattered to Sargon mattered to Stalin. The same routes that the Persians guarded, the Americans and Soviets now guarded. History hadn't started over in 1945. It had simply continued with new players wearing modern uniforms. The Korean War wasn't about ideology. It was about who would control the strategic peninsula that juts into the sea between China, Russia, and Japan. The exact peninsula that empires had fought over for thousands of years because it was a geographic prize. Vietnam wasn't about spreading communism or defending democracy. Those were the narratives. The reality was that Vietnam occupied a crucial position on the trade routes between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. the same position that made it valuable to Chinese emperors, to French colonizers, and eventually to American strategists. The Cuba Missile Crisis, Berlin, the Middle East, every single flashpoint of the Cold War occurred in a location that had geographic significance, not random significance. Significant because that location had been significant for centuries. The Soviet Union wanted control of the Eastern European plains because whoever holds the plains controls the gateway to Western Europe. That's not ideology. That's geography. That's the same reason the Mongols wanted those plains. That's the same reason the Ottomans wanted them. That's the same reason every empire wanted them. And this is the moment when you might be thinking, wait, isn't this just geography? Doesn't every nation want to expand its power? Yes, absolutely. But the point is that geography determines which nations can expand, in which directions, and how far. The United States became a superpower not because Americans were inherently smarter or more ambitious than anyone else. The United States became a superpower because it sits on a continent with natural defenses, 2 oceans, weaker neighbors, abundant resources. The same geography that protected early Rome from its enemies also protected early America, 2,000 years apart. Same advantage. That's not a coincidence. That's geography, writing the script. The Soviet Union, by contrast, sits on a landmass with no natural ocean barriers to its west. Every major power in history that sat on that same position, the Russians, the Ottomans, the Persians, they all faced the same problem: open borders. Open borders mean constant threat. Constant threat means you're always building armies, always expanding, always seeking buffer zones. You expand because geography forces you to expand. It's not a character flaw, it's geography. And this explains why the Soviet Union constantly pushed westward, why it wanted Eastern Europe, why it wanted Berlin. Not because communist ideology demanded it, because geography demanded it. Because 5,000 years of empires had faced the same geographic reality and made the same moves. Here's what makes this so powerful. Once you understand that geography, not ideology, is the prime mover of empires, everything about the Cold War suddenly makes sense. It wasn't communism versus capitalism that divided the world. Those were the languages used to justify the division. The real division was geographic. The world was divided into geographic zones of influence, and whoever controlled each zone used whatever ideology made sense for controlling it. Stalin used communism. Truman used democracy, but they were both just fighting over the same pieces of earth that empires had fought over for 5,000 years. This realization transforms how you read history. It means that when the Soviet Union tried to take over Berlin, it wasn't a sudden communist plot. It was the continuation of 5,000 years of empires trying to control the same geographic gateway. When the United States drew a line across Korea, it wasn't arbitrary. It was establishing control over a peninsula that had been strategically valuable since the ancient world. When American strategists worried about falling dominoes in Southeast Asia, they weren't entirely wrong, but not because of communism spreading, because whoever controlled Southeast Asia controlled the trade routes, and whoever controlled the trade routes controlled the money and the power. Now, you might be wondering, if geography determines everything, does that mean empires have no choice? That free will doesn't exist in history? The answer is more nuanced. Geography determines the options available, but humans choose which options to take. Stalin could have decided not to push westward from Moscow, but geography made that choice extraordinarily difficult. American presidents could have decided not to oppose Soviet expansion, but geography made that choice strategically dangerous. Geography doesn't determine choices, it determines consequences. Take the geographically smart choice, and your empire lasts. Take the geographically stupid choice, and you fall. This is why empires that understood geography, Rome, the Ottomans, Britain, the United States, lasted longer than empires that didn't. Rome understood that the Mediterranean was the center of the known world, and controlling the Mediterranean meant controlling the empire. The Ottomans understood that controlling the straits between Europe and Asia was the key to their power. Britain understood that naval supremacy, guaranteed by its island geography, made it the dominant power for 2 centuries, and the United States understood that controlling the Pacific and Atlantic, thanks to its geographic position, made it the superpower. The Cold War, when you strip away the ideology, was really just the latest chapter in a 5,000-year story of empires fighting over the same pieces of land. It was Russia, which sits on the open steppes, trying to secure its borders and expand its buffer zones, just as every empire that sat in that position had done before. It was America, which sits on a protected island continent, trying to prevent any rival from achieving dominance in the Eastern Hemisphere, just as Britain had done in the previous era. The names changed, the weapons changed, the ideological justifications changed, but the fundamental geographic logic remained absolutely constant. And here's where it gets really interesting. Understanding this geographic logic explains not just why wars happened, but why they happened when they did, where they did, and why certain regions became flashpoints while others remained quiet. Korea and Vietnam and Afghanistan and the Middle East weren't randomly chosen battlegrounds. They were battlegrounds because they occupied specific geographic positions in the larger chess game of empire. Understanding the geography means understanding why leaders made the moves they made, often moves that seemed irrational or even suicidal until you understood the geographic logic beneath them. Let's start with Korea. After Japan surrendered in 1945, Korea wasn't liberated into independence. It was divided. The Americans and Soviets agreed at Yalta and Potsdam that the peninsula would be split at the 38th parallel, a completely arbitrary line drawn by two American officers on a map in a matter of hours. No Korean asked for this division. No Korean leadership was consulted. The line was drawn because geography demanded it. The Soviets wanted a buffer state between their Far Eastern territories and the American-occupied Japanese archipelago. The Americans accepted the division because they needed Soviet help against Japan and because they believed the division would be temporary. Everyone said it would be temporary. It wasn't. By 1948, two separate Korean states had emerged. The North, controlled by the Soviets, developed under Kim Il-sung, a communist guerrilla who had fought the Japanese and now ruled with Soviet tanks and ideology. The South, occupied by American troops, developed under Syngman Rhee, an anti-communist strongman who had been living in exile in the United States and who returned on American ships. Neither leader was elected by the Korean people. Neither represented a genuine expression of Korean democracy. Both were imposed by foreign powers because geography had divided them and ideology had hardened the division into permanence. By early 1950, Kim Il-sung had assembled one of the most powerful armies in Asia, 200,000 troops, heavily equipped with Soviet tanks, artillery, and aircraft. He believed the moment had come to reunify Korea by force. The Americans, meanwhile, had drawn a defensive line that explicitly excluded Korea. Secretary of State Dean Acheson had announced in January 1950 that America's defensive perimeter in Asia ran from Japan through the Philippines, but did not include Korea or Taiwan. The message was clear. If Korea is invaded, don't expect American intervention. That was the signal Kim Il-sung needed. On June 25, 1950, without warning or negotiation, 75.0000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000 and unprepared. Seoul fell within 3 days. The South Korean government fled southward in panic. Refugees streamed behind them. Old men, women carrying infants, families on foot, everything they owned balanced on their backs or in wooden carts. The invasion was swift, brutal, and nearly complete. By early July, North Korean forces had pushed the Americans and South Koreans into a tiny pocket in the far south, near the port city of Pusan. The war everyone said would never happen was happening. But President Truman didn't hesitate. Despite Acheson's public exclusion of Korea from America's defensive perimeter, despite Congress being asleep when the invasion happened, despite the fact that America's military had been dramatically reduced since World War II, Truman made a decision that would shape the Cold War for the next 4 decades. He would go to war without a declaration of war. He called it a police action authorized by the United Nations, and he sent American troops to fight in Korea. The geographic logic was unavoidable. If Korea fell to communism, Japan would be surrounded. If Japan fell, the entire Western position in Asia would collapse like dominoes. The geography demanded a response. The war unfolded in phases, each one driven by geography. In July and August, American forces barely held the Pusan perimeter, a small pocket of territory in the far southeast, surrounded by North Korean forces. It looked like defeat was inevitable. Then, in September, General Douglas MacArthur executed one of the most audacious amphibious operations in military history. Instead of reinforcing Pusan directly, he landed 70,000 troops far behind enemy lines at Incheon, on the west coast of Korea. The landing was only possible because of geography. Incheon's tidal patterns were extreme and unpredictable, and most commanders believed an amphibious landing there was impossible. MacArthur believed otherwise. The landing succeeded. North Korean forces, suddenly surrounded, collapsed and retreated northward in panic. Seoul was retaken. The Americans had seized the military initiative. But MacArthur, emboldened by success, made a fatal geographic mistake. He pushed northward toward the Yalu River, the border between Korea and China. He believed China would not intervene, that the Chinese communists were too weak and too focused on consolidating power at home to enter a foreign war. He was wrong. In late October 1950, 300,000 Chinese troops crossed the Yalu River and attacked the American and South Korean forces. The Chinese had a geographic advantage. They were fighting on terrain they knew, they had interior lines of communication, and they could move troops and supplies across their own border. The Americans were fighting deep in enemy territory, far from their bases, with long supply lines stretched thin across a hostile peninsula. The winter of 1950 to 1951 was catastrophic. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees. Equipment froze. Men froze. The Americans retreated south, regrouped, counterattacked, and slowly stabilized a new front that ran roughly along the original 38th parallel. The war became a grinding stalemate. MacArthur, frustrated that he couldn't pursue an all-out military victory, began publicly criticizing Truman's limited war strategy. He wanted to expand the war, bomb Chinese cities, invade China, potentially use atomic weapons. Truman, understanding that a direct war with China could trigger Soviet intervention and spiral into World War III, couldn't allow it. In April 1951, Truman made another momentous decision. He fired General MacArthur, relieved him of command, ordered him home, and replaced him with General Matthew Ridgway. It was the most dramatic assertion of civilian control over the military since the founding of the Republic. MacArthur had been America's greatest military hero, the man who had conquered Japan, the icon of American power. And Truman removed him because MacArthur was willing to risk global nuclear war for total victory in Korea. The geographic logic of the Cold War demanded a different kind of thinking: limited wars, strategic patience, acceptance of stalemate rather than pursuit of total victory. The Korean War settled into a brutal static warfare that would last for 2 more years. Both sides dug in. Artillery barrages became daily routine. Soldiers fought and died over hills with numbers instead of names. Heartbreak Ridge, Old Baldy, Porkchop Hill. Nothing moved. Territory changed hands again and again, but nothing changed. By the time an armistice was signed in July 1953, more than 2 million people were dead, soldiers and civilians alike. Korea remained divided at roughly the same 38th parallel where it had been divided in 1945. Millions of families remained separated. Nothing had been resolved. The geography had dictated the division, and the war had simply cemented it. Wait, before we continue, I need to pause here for a moment. This is where understanding the deeper patterns becomes crucial. The Korean War wasn't fought because of Korean nationalism or Korean interests. It was fought because of geography, because of how the maps had been drawn by foreign powers, and because of how ideology had turned those maps into permanent features of the global order. If you want to understand not just what happened, but why the Cold War unfolded the way it did, the mechanisms and patterns that governed superpower conflict across decades, our complete in-depth guide on Cold War power structures and geographic strategy is available in the description and pinned to the top of the comments. It goes far deeper into how geography shapes foreign policy decisions, how military strategy emerges from terrain and logistics, and how the Cold War's major flashpoints were all determined by geographic factors that most people never even consider. This guide is a paid resource that gives you the full framework behind these events. The lesson from Korea shaped everything that came next. American leaders learned that they could fight limited wars without triggering global nuclear catastrophe. They learned that geography constrained the possible outcomes of war. You couldn't achieve total victory if your opponent controlled terrain and could resupply from adjacent territory. They learned that public opinion at home mattered, that Americans would tolerate sacrifice for a while, but would eventually demand results or withdrawal. And they learned that the Soviet Union, despite its power, had limits. It could equip allies and provide logistical support, but it wouldn't directly enter a war against American forces if the cost was too high. But while Korea was settling into stalemate, tension was building in a completely different part of the world. Cuba, an island nation 90 miles off the coast of Florida, was about to become the flashpoint where the Cold War came closest to nuclear annihilation, and the path that led there began not with missiles or weapons, but with revolution. In 1952, a military coup brought Fulgencio Batista to power in Cuba. Batista was a strongman, corrupt and brutal, but he was friendly to American business interests. American corporations owned vast portions of Cuba's economy: the sugar plantations, the utilities, the casinos and hotels in Havana, where American tourists and mobsters gathered to gamble and drink. Cuba's wealth flowed out to American investors and back into the hands of a narrow elite of Cuban collaborators. The Cuban people, the sugar workers, the rural peasants, the urban poor, received almost nothing. The geography of the Caribbean meant that Cuba had always been within America's sphere of influence. The island sat in the middle of American trade routes, was close to American territory, and could not be allowed to become hostile to American interests. That had been true since the Spanish-American War in 1898. It was axiomatic. Cuba belonged to America's regional empire, just as Korea had been divided by American and Soviet military occupation, just as the Philippines and Taiwan and every other strategic location had been claimed and controlled by one superpower or the other. But in the mountains of southeastern Cuba, a young lawyer named Fidel Castro was organizing a revolution. Castro had run for office as a reformist in 1952, before Batista's coup cancelled all elections. When the coup made that impossible, he turned to armed rebellion. In 1953, he led an attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago. The attack failed catastrophically. Castro and his followers were captured, tried, and imprisoned. But Castro became a martyr. From prison, he wrote a famous speech, "History will absolve me." The words resonated with Cubans who were desperate for change. Castro was released from prison in 1955 as part of a general amnesty. He immediately left Cuba and went to Mexico, where he gathered together a small force of committed rebels, fewer than 100 men. On December 2, 1956, Castro and his rebels, including a young Argentine doctor named Ernesto Che Guevara, boarded a small yacht called the Granma and set out for Cuba. The invasion was a disaster. The yacht was slow and overcrowded. The landing zone was poorly chosen. The Cuban military was waiting. Most of the invaders were killed or captured. Only 12 men, including Castro and Guevara, managed to escape into the Sierra Maestra Mountains in southeastern Cuba. From those mountains, with just a handful of men and limited supplies, Castro waged a guerrilla war against Batista's army of 40,000 soldiers. The geography of the Sierra Maestra was perfect for guerrillas: steep mountains, dense vegetation, few roads, difficult terrain that favored small mobile units over large conventional armies. Castro's rebels grew in numbers as peasants from the surrounding countryside joined them, attracted by the promise of land reform and social change. By late 1958, after 2 years of guerrilla warfare, Batista's army had been defeated in the field, his soldiers were deserting, and his military commanders had lost the will to fight. On January 1, 1959, Fulgencio Batista boarded a plane and fled Cuba. He took with him whatever money and assets he could carry. He left behind a bankrupt government, a demoralized army, and a power vacuum. Fidel Castro, leading his bearded rebels down from the mountains, entered Havana as the new leader of Cuba. The Cuban people celebrated in the streets. This was their revolution. This was their moment. They believed they had finally reclaimed their island from American domination. The Americans, watching from Washington and Miami, were alarmed but not yet panicked. Castro had promised land reform and had talked about democracy. The American State Department initially took a wait-and-see approach, but Castro's vision for Cuba was fundamentally at odds with American interests. He nationalized the sugar plantations. He seized American corporate assets. He demanded that American companies pay fair prices for Cuban resources instead of extracting wealth for nothing. He redistributed land to peasants. He closed down the casinos and ended the exploitation of Havana as a playground for American mobsters and rich tourists. From the American perspective, this was unacceptable. Castro was undoing the entire structure of American economic dominance in the Caribbean. Other Latin American countries were watching. If Cuba could successfully break free from American control and reorganize its economy for the benefit of its own people, other countries might try the same thing. The domino theory, which had justified the Korean War, now applied to Latin America. One falling domino, Cuba, might trigger others throughout the hemisphere. The Eisenhower administration, led by President Dwight Eisenhower and his new Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, decided on a policy of destabilization. They would not accept Castro. They would work to overthrow him. The CIA began planning an invasion. They would train Cuban exiles, give them weapons, send them to Cuba to ignite a popular uprising that would topple Castro and restore a pro-American government. The plan was called Operation Zapata, but it would later become famous as the Bay of Pigs. It would be approved by the new Kennedy administration when Eisenhower left office, and it would become one of the great disasters of American foreign policy. But the story doesn't end with the Bay of Pigs invasion. That's coming, and it will matter tremendously. What matters right now is understanding why Cuba became so central to American Cold War strategy. The island's geography, just 90 miles from Florida, positioned to control the Caribbean approaches to the Panama Canal, able to project influence throughout Latin America, made it strategically vital. The loss of Cuba to a government that was explicitly anti-American and increasingly aligned with the Soviet Union was, from the American perspective, a catastrophic shift in the balance of power. And it was about to become much more than a regional problem. The Soviet Union, watching America's attempt to overthrow Castro, decided to support the Cuban Revolution. The Kremlin saw an opportunity to extend Soviet influence into America's own hemisphere, to demonstrate that communism was not merely a European phenomenon, and to gain a strategic foothold in the Western Caribbean. Soviet military advisors arrived in Cuba. Soviet weapons began flowing to the island. The relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union deepened. By 1962, the two nations had grown so close that the Soviets would begin placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, the moment when the Cold War would come closest to nuclear annihilation, and when geography would truly become destiny. This is where geography and ideology collide most dramatically. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 would last just 13 days, but in those 13 days, the world would stand on the edge of nuclear war. The resolution of that crisis would depend entirely on how American and Soviet leaders understood the geographic constraints on their own power, and how willing they were to back down when the alternative was mutual annihilation. But before we get to that moment, you need to understand what Kennedy's administration had inherited, what mistakes they had already made, and why they were so desperate to find a way out of the mess they had created. Kennedy had come to office in January 1961, inheriting not only Eisenhower's Cold War strategy, but also the Bay of Pigs plan. The CIA had assured him that the invasion would succeed, that the Cuban exiles would be able to land, that the Cuban people would rise up in support, and that Castro's government would collapse. Kennedy, young and wanting to prove his toughness against communism, approved the plan. It proceeded in April 1961, and it failed catastrophically. The failure was humiliating for Kennedy. It was also a gift to Fidel Castro. The failed invasion attempt proved to the Cuban people that their government was facing an external threat from the United States, and it rallied them to Castro's defense. It also proved to the Soviet Union that the Americans were willing to use military force to overthrow governments they didn't like, and it convinced Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev that Cuba needed stronger Soviet protection. The path to the Cuban Missile Crisis was now irreversible. Between the spring of 1961 and the fall of 1962, the Soviet Union accelerated its military commitment to Cuba. Ships carrying weapons and military personnel crossed the Atlantic regularly. Soviet military advisors arrived on the island, some of them disguised as agricultural technicians or sports delegations to avoid detection. The buildup was visible to American intelligence agencies, but the full scale of the operation wasn't immediately understood. Not until aerial photographs taken by American U-2 spy planes revealed the shocking truth. the Soviet Union was placing nuclear missiles in Cuba. The question of why the Soviets did this is important. Nikita Khrushchev faced several pressures. The Soviet military was demanding more aggressive action against the Americans. China was criticizing the Soviet Union for being too timid in its support of communist movements around the world. The Cuban Revolution was Soviet communism's greatest success in the Western Hemisphere, and Castro had become a symbol of Soviet power and reach. Losing Cuba to an American invasion would be a catastrophic blow. So Khrushchev and the Soviet leadership decided to place tactical and strategic nuclear missiles in Cuba, a bold move to deter American invasion and to demonstrate that the Soviet Union could project power into America's own hemisphere. The missiles that the Soviets planned to place in Cuba were not tactical weapons meant only for local defense. They were strategic nuclear missiles capable of reaching the continental United States. The R-12 missiles had a range of about 1,000 miles, enough to hit Washington, D.C., and most of the eastern United States. The R-14 missiles, longer-range weapons, could reach targets across the entire country. If these missiles were successfully deployed, they would represent a fundamental shift in the global balance of power. For the first time since the end of the Second World War, the United States would face an existential threat on its own continent. No longer would Americans have the luxury of geographic distance. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans would no longer serve as barriers between themselves and Soviet nuclear capability. The calculus of deterrence, which had held the line between the superpowers for over a decade, would be fundamentally altered. When Kennedy learned the full scope of what was happening in Cuba, he understood that waiting was no longer an option. The missiles would be operational within days. The president convened his closest advisors, a group that came to be called the Executive Committee, or EXCOM, in the White House Situation Room. These were the men who would help shape the response: Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, CIA Director John McCone, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, and the President's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Over 13 days, they would debate options that ranged from diplomatic negotiation to a full-scale invasion of Cuba, with multiple military strikes somewhere in between. The first instinct of the military leadership was to recommend immediate air strikes. General Curtis LeMay, the Strategic Air Command Chief, who had orchestrated the firebombing of Japan during the Second World War, advocated for bombing the missile sites before they became operational. Such an action, LeMay argued, would eliminate the threat and restore American strategic superiority in a single blow. But there was a critical problem with this approach. No one could guarantee that American bombs would destroy every single missile site. If even one R-12 or R-14 remained hidden and operational after the strike, it might be launched at an American city in retaliation. The risk was unacceptable. Kennedy made a different choice. On October 22, 1962, he appeared on television to inform the American people of the situation and to announce a naval blockade, a quarantine, he called it, using language that suggested something less than an act of war, around Cuba. American warships would intercept and turn back any Soviet vessels attempting to deliver additional military equipment to the island. At the same time, Kennedy sent a personal letter to Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The president demanded the immediate removal of all offensive weapons from Cuba and made clear that the United States would take whatever action was necessary to ensure American security. For the next 13 days, the world existed in a state of unprecedented tension. At sea, American destroyers and cruisers formed a blockade around Cuba. Soviet cargo ships steamed toward the island, their captains uncertain whether their orders required them to break through the American cordon or to turn back. In the skies above Cuba, American U-2 spy planes continued their reconnaissance missions, photographing the construction of the missile sites. Each new image that arrived at the Pentagon revealed that the Soviets were working faster than expected. The missiles would be ready to launch within days, not weeks. What very few people knew during those 13 days, what remained classified for decades, was how close the world came to nuclear war. In the depths of the Atlantic Ocean, a Soviet submarine, the B-59, was operating beneath the American blockade. The submarine carried a nuclear-armed torpedo, a weapon that could destroy an entire American aircraft carrier in a single explosion. The captain of the B-59, Valentin Grigorievich Savitsky had been at sea for weeks without reliable communication with Moscow. When American destroyers overhead began dropping depth charges, explosive charges designed to force the submarine to the surface, Savitsky believed that war had already begun. He made the decision to authorize the use of the nuclear torpedo against an American ship. But Savitsky was not the only officer on the submarine with authority over the weapon. Standing beside him was Vasily Arkhipov, a Soviet naval officer and the flotilla commander. Arkhipov had served in the Soviet Navy for 15 years and understood the full consequences of a nuclear war. In that moment of extreme tension, with the submarine damaged and under attack, with war seemingly inevitable, Arkhipov refused to authorize the launch of the nuclear torpedo. He insisted that Savitsky contact Moscow for confirmation before taking any action. In the chaos and fear of those moments, Arkhipov's insistence on procedure became the single action that prevented nuclear war. The submarine B-59 did not launch its nuclear weapon. Savitsky stood down. The depth charges continued to fall, but the nuclear threshold was not crossed. For another week, the crisis continued. Behind closed diplomatic doors, American and Soviet representatives negotiated terms that might satisfy both sides. Finally, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba, in exchange for an American promise not to invade the island. Additionally, there was a secret agreement, one that only became public years later, in which Kennedy agreed to remove American Jupiter missiles that were stationed in Turkey. The trade was not equal in appearance, but it was balanced in reality. Both sides backed away from the edge. Wait, this part is absolutely critical to understand, and I need you to follow carefully for a moment. What you have just witnessed in this account of the Cuban Missile Crisis is not simply a dangerous historical episode that happened to work out. What happened in October 1962 represents the mechanics of how nuclear deterrence actually worked during the Cold War, and why those mechanisms were far more fragile than most people understood. If you want to grasp the full operation of the Cold War system, the invisible rules that kept the superpowers from destroying each other, the pressure points where miscalculation could slip into catastrophe, and the precise moments where human judgment made the difference between survival and annihilation, our in-depth guide in the description and pinned comment walks through all of these mechanisms with declassified documents and expert analysis. It is a resource that goes far deeper than what a video format allows. But the real story of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the story that American newspapers and television did not fully convey at the time, was this. The world came to the edge of nuclear war, not because of a deliberate Soviet assault or an American act of aggression, but because the mechanisms of deterrence were operating exactly as they had been designed to operate. Both sides were frightened. Both sides had contingency plans that assumed the other side might attack. Both sides had weapons that were on alert and ready to launch. Both sides believed, with varying degrees of certainty, that the other side was preparing for war. And in that environment of mutual fear, mutual misunderstanding, and mutual preparations for violence, a single miscalculation, a submarine captain's belief that war had already begun, a decision by an American pilot to fire on a Soviet vessel, a miscommunication between Moscow and one of its commanders in the field, any one of these could have triggered the nuclear exchange that would have ended civilization as Americans knew it. The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted 13 days. When it ended, both American and Soviet leadership had gained a new understanding of how close nuclear war could come, without any of the traditional triggers that might be expected to cause it. There had been no Pearl Harbor-style surprise attack. There had been no ultimatum with a deadline that one side refused to accept. There had been no moment at which either side explicitly decided to initiate warfare. Instead, the world had drifted toward the edge of nuclear catastrophe through a process of action and reaction, fear and defensive preparation, miscommunication and mutual misunderstanding. The crisis ended not because the mechanisms of deterrence worked perfectly, but because, at the crucial moment, human beings on both sides chose restraint. In the months and years that followed, the Cuban Missile Crisis produced a slow evolution in Cold War thinking. Both superpowers recognized that communication needed to be improved. They established the hotline, a direct telephone connection between the White House and the Kremlin, designed specifically to allow leaders to communicate in moments of crisis without the delays and distortions that had nearly caused nuclear war. They signed arms control agreements that began, for the first time, to place limits on the nuclear arsenals that both sides were continuously expanding. They began to speak, in careful language, of the concept of mutual assured destruction, the idea that if both sides had enough weapons to destroy each other many times over, neither side would risk initiating nuclear war because the consequences would be too terrible to contemplate. But mutual assured destruction was not a solution to the Cold War. It was a description of a terrible new reality. The superpowers had created weapons so destructive that their only function was to deter their use. And now, I need to reveal to you the secret that was promised at the beginning of this video. You learned that ancient empires rose and fell in cycles of conquest and collapse. You learned that the patterns of empire, the expansion of one power, the resistance of rivals, the eventual clash and the restructuring of the global order, repeated across thousands of years. You learned that these patterns shaped human civilization from Mesopotamia to Rome to the European colonial powers of the 19th century. But here is the secret that connects all of that history to the Cuban Missile Crisis. By the time the 20th century arrived, by the time the Cold War had begun, human beings had created a new kind of power, nuclear power, that made the old patterns of empire building catastrophically dangerous. In the ancient world, when Sargon conquered his neighbors, he expanded his territory and his wealth. When Rome conquered Britain, Rome gained resources and military dominance. But when the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, and when the United States surrounded the island with warships carrying nuclear weapons, neither side was trying to expand territory or to gain resources. They were engaged in something entirely new, a contest to position their instruments of mutual destruction in ways that maximize their power relative to their rival while minimizing the risk that those instruments would actually be used. It was a game of positioning and signaling and threat and counter-threat, and it required a completely new kind of thinking about power itself. For 5,000 years, the story of human power had been the story of one group of people trying to dominate others, trying to control territory, resources, people. That drive never changed. But nuclear weapons created a situation in which the attempt to achieve complete dominance, the attempt to build such overwhelming power that no rival could challenge you, became the path to mutual destruction. The Soviet Union could never build enough missiles to guarantee that it could destroy all American missiles before they were launched. The United States could never build enough missiles to guarantee that it could eliminate the Soviet threat. And so both superpowers entered into a bizarre new relationship. They were rivals, they were ideological enemies, they were military adversaries, but they were also locked together in a system that only worked if both of them survived. If either side destroyed the other, both would be destroyed. The empire-building impulse that had driven human history for millennia had crashed into a wall created by physics and chemistry and mathematics. The Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated this new reality in its most vivid and frightening form. It showed that even when neither side intended to start a nuclear war, the mere positioning of nuclear weapons in a standoff could create conditions where war might begin by accident or miscalculation. The crisis ended in a Soviet retreat and an American strategic victory. Khrushchev removed the missiles from Cuba, and Kennedy's reputation was enhanced. But the deeper historical truth is more subtle. Both superpowers learned that the old patterns of imperial confrontation no longer applied. In the age of nuclear weapons, victory could not be achieved by defeating your enemy. Victory could only be achieved by ensuring that your enemy survived, because the only alternative to mutual survival was mutual destruction. This is the revelation promised to you at the very beginning of this video. The 5,000-year arc of human power struggles, the empires that rose and fell, the cycles of conquest and resistance, the patterns that seem to repeat endlessly across civilizations, led directly to a moment, in October 1962, when those ancient patterns collided with modern physics. The contest for dominance that had driven human history from the Sumerians to the Soviets suddenly became impossible to win in the traditional sense, and that impossibility, that realization that you could no longer defeat your enemy without destroying yourself, became the strange, unstable foundation upon which the rest of the Cold War would be built. Take this away from our discussion today. The old competition for empire did not end with the nuclear age. It transformed. Both superpowers still wanted dominance, still wanted to expand their influence, still wanted to win the global competition for power. But they learned, through near-catastrophic accidents and close calls like the Cuban Missile Crisis, that the traditional ways of achieving dominance no longer applied. They had to invent new rules, new language, new ways of thinking about victory and defeat. They had to learn to live with a rival in a way that previous empires never had to do. This week, consider this. In your own life, where might you be applying old solutions to new problems? Where might the desire to completely dominate a situation actually make it more dangerous? Sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when to stand down. Thank you for watching this journey through 5,000 years of power and empire, leading to the moment when that entire system of dominance became impossible. If this account of how ancient history shaped the Cold War has resonated with you, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video in this series, each one unpacking another crucial moment of the Cold War with the same historical depth and clarity. Leave a comment below telling me which moment in this story surprised you most or changed how you think about power itself. Hit the like button so the algorithm knows you want more of this kind of history, and please activate your notification bell. That way, when we release our next episode, you'll get notified immediately and you can be part of this exploration of the era that shaped our modern world from its very beginning. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.